Happy Friday, everybody. Secret, we're recording this a couple days early, but if you're watching this, it is most likely Friday, May the 3rd, and the Calgary Wranglers are getting set to kick off their second-round playoff series against the Coachella Valley Firebirds. It's a best-of-5 series. They're going to host games 1 and 2 at the Saddledome. Game 1 goes tonight, and we're very excited to break this all down for you in our Calgary Wranglers series preview, brought to you by Betway. My name is Mike Gould. I'm joined today by a couple of very prestigious and excellent guests, both from Flames Nation. First, we're just going to introduce one by one. We're going to go with Ryan Pike. He's our managing editor. He does all sorts of things over at Flames Nation. He wears a lot of hats, and he is our arena aficionado. But he's going to be at game 1 and 2, I think, as a fan. Piker, we're so happy to have you.
I like the fact that I'll be a little bit closer to the ice, and I can drink.
Yes, that's right. That's right. They don't even give you any free refreshments, unfortunately, at the Wranglers games. If you're up in the press box, you got to go down all the way down into the bowels of the rink. It's easier to get there from the main level where you're going to be sitting. I don't know, but somebody who is going to be sitting up in the upper level, I presume, for games 1 and 2 is our other friend, Paige. Paige Seward, who has been covering the Wranglers ever since they came to Calgary, before that in Stockton, and before that, the Kansas City Mavericks, all sorts of stuff coming from our good friend Paige, and we're so happy to have her on our show as well. Paige, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Nice seeing you guys.
There's nobody better than Paige because frankly, Paige has watched more Wranglers hockey. Probably, I can only speak for myself, but probably more Wranglers hockey of the last 2 seasons than Pike and I combined. I think Pike would say that's.
She's definitely the clubhouse leader. I don't know by how much, but by a fair margin.
I don't think we're keeping score, but.
No, I think that's absolutely correct. Paige has been a stalwart at the press box at the Saddledome for these Wranglers games, and we're so excited for game 1, which, when again you're going to be watching this, is going to go tonight. But first of all, and Paige, I just want to throw this to you first. The Wranglers are not necessarily the team they were in their inaugural season, just in terms of their overall success in the regular season, not being at the top of their division. But they're playing against Coachella Valley. This is a team that they faced off against last year. Somewhat controversially, they elected to start that series at home as the higher seed. This time around, Coachella Valley is the higher seed, and they're starting the series on the road. Just what can you tell us a little bit about the format? What's a little bit different than last year, perhaps, with these two teams, and just the way that you expect to see this to go?
Yeah, so last year with the Wranglers finishing at the top of the division, they got the first round bye, and now that's flipped. So they're not as close with Coachella Valley as they were last year. It was pretty much neck and neck for the top of the division. This year, they just squeaked by with the 7th spot in the Pacific Division to make it to playoffs, but then they still end up in the same spot in the second round here. So now Coachella Valley comes in with a first round bye, so we don't have any stats or any information on their first round because there was no first round. But I think the Wranglers did well in their series against them last year, but you could definitely feel there's a little bit of that coming back up to speed after having a week off. Yes, you get to practice, but you're not getting game action or anything. So I'm curious to see if they get a better start to this series because they had that series against Tucson. The AHL is different where you're not having the best of 7 series every single round. They essentially had kind of like a play-in series against Tucson for the first round for a best of 3. Now they're going into a best of 5. So it's still, especially starting the Wranglers at home, getting those first 2 wins is going to be a huge advantage when they go back to Coachella Valley to try and either close a series or wherever that ends up. But last year was very close between them. They went the whole way, all 5 games, and unfortunately the Wranglers lost in the 5th game in overtime. If anyone was following along with that last year as well, they also had a very famous triple overtime in the 3rd game that also didn't go the Wranglers' way. So all these guys are really going to want to kind of build off of last year. If they take it to the extra periods, close the door on it, and it's really feeling like a fresh start for them. We're not really looking at what happened in the regular season with the Wranglers and the Coachella Valley Firebirds because now this is all that matters for them.
Yeah, it's a very different team, and Pike, we've talked a little bit about at Flames Nation about the players who have been in this Wranglers team's skates and development, and they're on their roster in tryout bases, and they've released some players from their tryouts, which has caused a little bit of consternation, I know, on the social media circles over recent days. But they're really just trimming down their roster, and as it gets down to it, we kind of know the guys who we're going to be seeing in this series.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give Trent Cull a lot of credit. I mean, when I believe our friend at Post Media, Wes Gilbertson, asked Ryan Huska after one of the Flames games. I think it was late in the season when the Wranglers clinched the value of the Wranglers even making it, and Ryan Huska gave a really nice answer to West, basically just mentioning, like, the Wranglers have been kind of rated throughout the season. At the time that Huska was answering, their all-star goalie was with the NHL. Matt Coronado, arguably the most dynamic offensive player, was in the NHL. We saw, Pelche was up and down. We saw Ilya Solovyov, arguably, I'd say their best pure defenseman, was in the NHL for a good chunk of the year. Adam Klapika got a run. Like, there's been a lot of really important Wranglers players basically plucked into the NHL, and a lot of them didn't go back. We saw, Connor Zary go up and never return. We saw Martin Pospisil go up and never return. Dryden Hunt went up and never returned. Like, you got to give a lot of credit to the coaching staff and Brad Pascal and the hockey ups department for just plugging in holes, because they found a way to keep things afloat with a lot of guys missing due to injuries. They missed, about a third of their defense was out at any given time. They missed, Brett. As much as he's sort of an old hand at this, Brett Sutter's still a really important player in the team in terms of sort of being their defensive conscience, and he was missing for a chunk of the season. So that's a long way of saying, I think they've done a really good job integrating guys in, and now this might be the first time. Paige, I'm sure you're aware of this. It must be the first time since like October that they're basically fully healthy, and they went to 11 forwards and 7 defensemen in the first series, and as a result, they had, even with 7 defensemen, Artem Grishnikov was on the outside looking in, Brady Lyles on the outside looking in, on the forward ranks. We've seen Rory Cairns have flashes of brilliance this year. He was a spectator. Lucas Siona has been a pretty effective checker. He was on the outside. Alex Gallant's been a really effective physical presence. He was on the outside. Some of the best fights, I'd say, in professional hockey this year were from Alex Gallant. But so they have a lot of, heck, Connor Murphy was a really big flash of brilliance in net this year. Probably, you could make an argument that they might not make the playoffs if Connor Murphy's not as good as he is down the stretch. He's the third string goalie right now because they're rolling with Oscar Dansk as the backup behind Dustin Wolf. And I think if you're looking at that group, they're going with the guys that give them the best chance. And I think they're going with, for lack of a better term, outside of Sam Morton, they're going with a lot of guys that were there all year. And I think they're probably going to roll with that until circumstance dictates that they change it. But, for going into a series with a really strong opponent, albeit an opponent that hasn't played in 2 weeks, I think there is probably a good way to start it off.
Absolutely. And I mean, going back to your point about how they were ransacked this season, very, very true. But it's not even just the players that they lost this season, it's the players that they've lost since last season. You look at their top 5 scorers from last year, and 4 of them aren't with the team anymore. You don't have Matthew Phillips, obviously. You don't have Connor Zary. You don't have Nick DeSimone, and you don't have Emilio Pettersson, who they traded to Dallas earlier this season. So it's a very, very different looking Wranglers group. But Paige, somebody who very much is still with this Wranglers team and has done very well, not just with the Wranglers, but with the Flames, and now is back with the Wranglers, of course, is Dustin Wolf. And you can't talk about this Wranglers team without talking about him. He's their star player. He's their top player. He's arguably one of the top players in the entire American Hockey League. He's the reigning league MVP. He's an absolutely phenomenal goaltender. Even being the lower seed against a team like Coachella Valley, when they were the higher seed last year, I was at the game at, I think it's Acrisure Arena in Palm Desert when Dustin Wolf posted a shutout in Game 4. It was a 1-0 final. Boy, I thought that there was no way he was going to let in another goal in that series after that game. So, what does Dustin Wolf mean to this team in terms of allowing them to have a chance in any playoff series?
Oh yeah, like especially going off the whole idea that you're not going to lose him to the Flames. Like he's with them. He can play every game if he needs to. He probably will play every game. Um, I think really, especially this year, seeing him in that Tucson series, like some of those games were big goaltending battles, and he would win them. And I mean, he's a huge difference maker. This might be the last chance that we have of seeing him in a playoff view for the AHL teams. I think he like the guys know what they have between the pipes. Dustin Wolf is known around the league. People know what they're getting up against, and the teams that have the better scouting report against him seem to be the ones that are more successful. So Coachella Valley is going to study the heck out of him to see how to beat him. He doesn't let a lot through, and especially he is one of those types of players that'll elevate his game when he needs to. And in a playoff series, obviously, this is when you need to. So I'm really excited to see what he does in this series, especially since I think the most memorable thing that happened last year in their playoff series was the last goal he let in the fifth game. It was the overtime winner, and he just kind of like laid his head down on the ice, and you just fell for him. It's like you knew that this was a really good chance for them to make it all the way and win the Calder Cup, and he felt like that entire series was on his shoulders. And he owns it. He's a humble guy. He's a great goaltender. I'd really like to see him have success in the series, and I don't doubt that he will. Something that I also wanted to mention in that goaltending perspective is they were also facing Joey Daccord last year, and Joey Daccord isn't with Coachella Valley anymore. He played all year with the Seattle Kraken. So I'm interested to see what those goaltending battles look like in this series with different guys between the pipes. So we shall see, I guess.
It's really good points, and you got to remember, I mean, like in the regular season this year, Dustin Wolf's numbers in the American League were low for his standards. And when we say they're low for his standards, what we mean is he was 20, 12, and 3 with 4 shutouts and a 922 save percentage, which is pretty hysterical.
People
Pike.
forget this, but when he got called up to the NHL, I think initially when Jacob Markstrom was hurt, and then kept up when Dan Vladar was ruled out for the season, he was on a losing streak. He hadn't won in 2 weeks, and that might be the longest rough patch of hockey he's had as a professional. But if you look at his underlying numbers, you go, that's his rough spot. Like a rough spot is just posting above average to respectable AHL numbers. And I think I'm really excited to see how he is, because I talked to folks I know in the organization. I think some of the challenges for Wolf this year was being the third guy, and with, he spent almost 2.5 months in the NHL this year, but almost none of it was consecutive. He was up for a week and down for a little bit, and he kept being yo-yoed. And goalies, from my understanding, I am not a goalie. Goalies are creatures of habit. They love their routines. They love their habits. And when you're doing your thing and then they call you up at a moment's notice and say, "Hey, get on a plane. You're going to New Jersey." That's doesn't really fit your routine. But when he was up at the end of the season, when the Flames said, "Hey, Vladar is being shut down. It's you're going to get games at a regular interval," I don't think it's any coincidence that his NHL numbers shot way up, because he finally looked like he went, okay, this is my net. I can do my thing. Just like we've seen that level of consistency and calmness from him in the American League level when he doesn't think he's going to be yoinked up at a moment's notice. So given, like you said, Paige, given that he knows this is his net, this is his domain, I don't think it's any coincidence that we saw arguably 2 of the best games we've seen out of him of the season at any level against Tucson. And I think he's going to go into the series with Coachella with a chip on his shoulder.
Saying they were the best 2 games of the season for him might be an understatement. When you look at it, he plays in these 2 games. He stops 86 shots in those 2 games, and he allows 3 goals. One of those games is a shutout, and he lifts the Wranglers past a heavily favored Tucson team. We're talking about a Tucson team that has Dylan Gunther, that has Josh Doan, that has Victor Soder. It's quite a good Tucson team that got a lot of players back from the NHL. But to their credit, the Wranglers did too. Another one of those guys is Matt Coronado. And, I think what we saw from Matt Coronado this season was a player learning how to be a pro. And that's a tough bridge to gap. And, we saw a guy who was inconsistent, but when he was in the American League, he scored at a rate that we hadn't really seen anybody else score at this year. He ended up around a point per game. And you look at the leading scores for this Wranglers team, very much unlike a year ago when you had the guys like Phillips and Zary and Pelche operating around that level. the top leading scorers on this Wranglers team this year over a full season were guys like Adam Klapka, who is a valuable player, but who was scoring more so around like 45 points in 65 games, that kind of level. Paige Coronado is a guy who has inspired some fierce debates, I know, in some some corners of the Flames community this year. But in terms of what he has done specifically with the Wranglers, just what have you seen him do in terms of growing, and what has he done well from the start?
Yeah, like I think he established his role in the AHL almost immediately. Like he once he realized that okay, I'm not with the Flames right now. I need to do everything I can to try and get the next NHL opportunity. He's obviously got to know that the fan base thinks really highly of him and is very excited for the future of him. So that adds some pressure, but it's not anything he isn't used to. So I think what I like the most about Coronado is he knows his role and he plays his role at the AHL level. I know when it kind of goes up to the NHL, he's still kind of figuring out what type of player he is with the Flames or at that NHL level. But he almost feels like he's replaced that scoring that disappeared over the summer or disappeared due to injury. So when we weren't having Jacob Pelche or we weren't having Connor Zary or any of those guys around, Matt Coronado was the guy. He'd have Ben Jones helping him out too, and those two were racing for top scoring for a bit as well. But Matt Coronado went back to the NHL and still kept the top scoring for a long time before other guys caught up to him. So he was their also one of their all-star representatives this year as well. I think everything that you wanted out of Coronado at the AHL level, you got this year, and I'm glad he got some of the opportunities at the NHL as well. Obviously, there's some development that needs to be done to kind of make that next jump, but I think he's very comfortable at the AHL and he knows what he's doing down there.
Like, people keep talking about Coronado, and it's hard to sort of determine what this guy's future looks like. I mean, I've talked lots about Coronado. Paige has talked lots about Coronado. People talk lots about Coronado, but what does this guy feature? What does this guy presume to be when you look 3-4 years down the line in a best case scenario with this Flames team under completely different circumstances, assuming a retool, a rebuild of some form has happened?
Well, I think we've seen some of the flashes of it this year because I mean, in October, like I had a long chat with him before one of the last games of the season. He and I just sort of sat down and caught up a bit. And the thing that he's a very smart kid. You don't get into Harvard by being dumb, and you don't play at that level and excel at that level without being pretty smart, but with the puck too. But I think he's obviously still learning the pro game. He's much more consistent than he was. He was, I think even he would admit, a little bit lost positionally early in the season, probably at both levels, because there's so much difference between the NHL, the AHL, and the NCAA that you're just going to naturally be like, okay, what am I supposed to do here? But the best thing I can say about him, especially at the NHL level in March and April, was he didn't have that the paralysis in terms of stopping and going, where am I supposed to be? The old fashioned, what am I supposed to do with my hands kind of thing. He automatically seemed to slid to where he needed to go. His positioning in all three zones is really, really good. Using his stick much more intelligently to disrupt. So with him, I think that for him, I don't know if there's necessarily a ceiling on him. I would say he's probably not a top line guy because I don't know if he has as many dynamic qualities in his game as other players do, but he doesn't have many holes either. He can, we're talking about a guy that, the NCAA, Mike, an Arizona player, one of their prospects was injured, one of the Harvard centers, and Harvard didn't have enough centers. So they said, Matt, you want to try it out? And he went, okay. And he was pretty good at it. So he's the kind of guy that loves a challenge and learns really quickly and adapts really well. And, we saw him play on the fourth line with the Flames, and he was generating offense and disrupting the flow of the other team's play. And he's created a lot of things. And I think if you give him, another few months, especially, potentially a long playoff run in the AHL, I think if he keeps building his game, building some confidence, I would say probably not a first liner at the NHL level. But if Matt Coronado turns into a good to very good second or third liner, like a middle six winger that can play on your power play, basically you can swap to either wing. He can play a lot of different game situations for you. And if he's someone you can trust in defensive situations, that's really, really valuable.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, go ahead, Paige.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I was just thinking too, it's like compared to the start of the season versus like second half of the season to now, he's also brought that physical part of his game that you didn't really see before. You're seeing him put up big hits, and you're like, oh, you're checking the numbers, and you're like, that was Coronado. But yeah, so I'm really interested to see what he does against Coachella Valley too, if he brings more of that game to it, because I think Coachella Valley is going to be a more physical team than maybe Tucson was.
Yeah, and especially at the NHL level, he was always in the right spot, especially later on in the year. He was always in the right spots and always knew where to be and was always in the battles. But I think just he's 20, 21 years old and a little bit physically underdeveloped. And I think you kind of need to go through a playoff series like the one he's about to go through to figure out that, okay, maybe I need to change my training or adapt my style a little bit to win those 50-50 battles, because he's always in them. But if he's the type of player that can win 10% more battles than he is right now, that's pretty substantial, and it ends up with your team having the puck a heck of a lot more than the other team.
That's where I see like the most area for growth with Coronado is those 50-50 puck battles, the board work, that sort of stuff. Where, if he grows a little bit in that respect, it's going to impact so many other areas of his game as well, in terms of him knowing where to go, being stronger positionally, that sort of stuff. And I keep saying, and I said it on, I think, the last Afterburner show that we did with Cammy, I think there's upside of, a guy like Travis Konechny with the right seasoning, with the right. There's a guy who took a little bit longer to physically develop, but once he did, man, he really turned into a good player for a player of that stature. And it's just, that's maybe your highest expectation. Your lower ones, maybe, hey, it's a second, third line guy who can ship in, but there's a lot of stuff to like. And this is coming from a guy who, again, has seen Coronado this season, has liked certain things, has been a little bit iffy on other things, but there's a lot of reason for optimism with that player. And boy, he sure showed it in the regular season. And he had a goal and assist in those two games against Tucson in the first round. So I'm curious to see what he can do against Coachella Valley. Before we go any further, we just need to tell the people about the good folks over at Betway who are bringing you this show. Folks, you can get the Betway app on your phone. You can bet the responsible way with Betway. With Betway, you can get a free bet up to $200 if your first bet loses. So create a new account, scan the QR code on the screen, and redeem your bonus. Place a bet with no minimum amount required, and if the bet loses, you'll get a refund up to $200, and you can use that money to bet on your favorite sports. This offer only available outside of Ontario with Betway. Well, there you go. That is our sponsor. Now, Pike, you and I have gone back and forth a little bit in recent years since the 2021 NHL draft. I think you know exactly what I'm going to talk about here, about the player the Flames picked in the second round. And I will readily admit I was a skeptic on William Stromgren, who, when first 2 years after his draft playing in Sweden, there were ups, there were downs. There was the World Juniors, which there didn't really, not a lot happened. But he comes over to North America. He signs an entry-level contract. The first couple months of his season, 2 to 3 months, not a whole lot happening. Midway through the season, a spark kind of flies, a switch flips. And William Stromgren has turned even the biggest skeptics, a guy like me, into a real believer in what this player can do. And I know it gives you so much pleasure to hear me say that after so long of me saying, well, there's this guy who went 2 picks later to Dallas who I had in the first round, and I think he would have been such a good player. But you know what? You can't give these players up against each other. You got to look at them in isolation. And Pike, what is it that excites you about William Stromgren?
Well, Brian Burke always said you don't measure draft picks by stopwatches, you measure them by calendars. And I think if you're looking at Stromgren on paper, you can kind of get why they liked him, because he's got that size. He can play either wing. He's, I believe, listed like 6'2" and close to 200 pounds, depending on what day you're weighing him. And he comes to the Flames after playing a fair amount of Swedish pro. Granted, I mean, folks, in Sweden, here's the deal with how they do things in Europe. And I think it's actually a pretty smart way of doing it. If you have players you think are going to bolt for North America, or younger players, you tend not to use them as much, because, what's the point of wasting developmental reps on helping someone else out? So typically, if you're in Sweden, if you're a bottom sixer, unless you're an exceptional player that they can't not use it higher up in the rotation, you tend to get third pairing, third line, fourth line minutes. And that's kind of what he had for a couple of years. And he came over to North America, and I think we saw a lot of the same things we saw from Adam Klapka last year, where Adam Klapka, North American hockey is very different in style and in rink dimension from European hockey. So there's a lot of different little things to figure out. Plus, if you're William Stromgren, you're living much like Klapka was, in a new country for the first time. Everything's in English all of a sudden rather than being in your home language. There's a lot of different things you have to adjust to. And so I think by, last year we saw by about Christmas to, right after New Year's, the flip, the switch flip for Klapka. I think we saw a lot of the same things that happened for Stromgren, where, you used to go, you wouldn't notice Stromgren in the first half of the year, or you'd go, ooh, what's he doing there? And then December, you started just not noticing him all the time and occasionally going, that's kind of a smart thing he did. And then as the season's worn on, especially in February, March, and into April, he's been one of their more effective players, because I think instead of, we mentioned the whole adjustment period for Coronado. I think now Stromgren knows where he's supposed to be, what he's supposed to do, and I think he has the confidence to try some stuff. We're seeing him throw his body around. He knows he's big, and he didn't have to play a physical style in Sweden because that's just not how it's played. The different refereeing standards are, obviously sometimes guys get penalties for leading into a guy. In the AHL, you can crush a guy, and as long as you're not going for his head, you're probably doing okay. And he's learning that he can do that. He's learning how to win battles, and he's being really effective. And we've seen him have the confidence to try to make plays, and we've seen him make a lot of really good plays. And I think it speaks to, the work the development staff has done with him, but I also think it speaks to the work that he's done, because by all accounts, the kid's kind of a sponge. And at 20 years old, living in a foreign country, playing in a league outside of his home country for the first time, he's really come into his own this year. And, he's the kind of guy that, I'll flat out say it, I'm pretty sure we're going to see him in the National Hockey League at some point next year, because there's so many little things he does that you can, I don't know if he's necessarily going to be a high-end National Hockey League player, but based on how he can chip in a lot of different situations at the AHL level, he projects as a pretty useful player in a lot of different ways. And, if you're the Flames and you look at a guy much like they did in this draft year, he's got size, he's got smarts, he's got the ability to chip in offensively, he's got the ability to play in a defensive role and still be effective. He can do a lot of different things. And I think, if you're the Flames, and especially if you're the scouting department, I think you look at this pick and this player and go, this is the kind of guy that I think they felt like they wanted to bet on. And I think they're feeling pretty good about that bet right now.
Yeah, and just to give our listeners a bit more context, because in the first 23 games of this regular season, William Stromgren had 2 points, and they were both assists. And it was tough sledding. He scores his first goal of the season on December 23rd. And after that, it kind of comes together. It takes a little while after his first goal, but then he has back-to-back multi-point games in late January. He has a 2-point night again against Tucson in early March. He has a 3-point night later in early April. He has points in back-to-back games ending the season. He ends up with 27 points in 68 games. And again, for a first-year pro, that is perfectly respectable, even without considering that a player scores 2 points in his first 23 games of the regular season. That's a stretch that, it raised some eyebrows. But I think the end of the season raised a lot more eyebrows. And Paige, then you have the playoffs, which I think really put Stromgren on the map in the first round against Tucson, where, game 1, he doesn't have any points, but game 2, he has 2. And that goal that he scores, I mean, holy moly, that was kind of the talk of hockey Twitter, at least in Calgary, for a couple hours after that game.
Yeah, like watching that live, and even like Sandra's comments on the play-by-play and everything, like we were just all like, everyone's jaws were on the floor, and I think no one picked them up until the end of the game, because oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Like he has skill, but you've only seen flashes of what he can actually do, and I still don't think we've seen the full potential of what Stromgren could be even in this playoff series. But that goal, oh my gosh, if you haven't seen it, go look it up, because like heads up play, it was huge for the Wranglers. It was the game winner too, if I'm not mistaken.
Series winner.
Yeah, so huge confidence boost for him. I was thinking the exact same thing you were saying, Mike, about how scoring that first goal kind of got the monkey off his back and got him going. And he is one of those players that is peaking at like the perfect time this season. So he might not be someone that, in a preseason preview, we probably would have thought would be like a game changer for, making the playoffs and going down through the playoffs. But I'm really interested to see what he does after coming off the 2 games against Tucson.
Yeah, I think you're 100% on the mark, both of you. I mean, again, this is a player who I was a skeptic of. I wasn't sure what to expect when he was coming out of Sweden. And the early part of the season, I was kind of, I don't know. But holy moly, I almost wonder, with the Emilio Pettersson trade that they make with Dallas, getting Riley Damiani, who's a center back in that deal, it kind of strikes me as a deal that they make because they know that Stromgren can play that spot and do a good job playing an elevated role on the wings. And it's been really fun to watch. He's been excellent, and I will say I could not be more excited to see what he does in this series against Coachella Valley, and it's the next season because this is a guy who's only 20. That's the crazy thing is he'll be 21 in June, and when you're 20, there's so much room not just to grow mentally, physically, maturity, so much stuff that we can see from William Stromgren. Very exciting player. Another player who's a little bit older, but also a winger, a player who we've seen a lot more from, but we didn't see a ton from this year for unfortunate reasons, is Jacob Pelche. And if this was last year, Pelche probably would have been one of the first players we would have talked about. But now we're getting to him sort of later in our show because it's been a really difficult year for Jacob Pelche, and it's not his fault. I was at that preseason game against the Seattle Kraken where he just got run over, and it was a dirty, dirty, dirty hit. And he misses the first, I don't know, 3/5 of the season because of it. He comes back. It doesn't really look like the same guy in the NHL. Goes back to the American League. Pike, this guy has a lot to prove.
Yeah, and you got to feel bad for him because so many guys. I think we're seeing this to a certain extent with Jeremy Poirier too, where guys you need the whole preseason to ramp up, and then you're at least meeting your opposition on sort of level playing field in terms of preparation. But when you miss almost all of the training camp with that injury, and then you're not really getting into games until January, and then he had that near miss almost re-injury against the Rangers where Jacob Trouba absolutely leveled him with kind of a questionable hit. I mean, he's very lucky that he wasn't re-injured, and I think everyone, he's such a nice human being and a good kid that when you saw, I think everyone around the team, when they saw that Trouba hit, their stomachs dropped a bit, going, "Oh God, not again!" And so it's good, not again, but he's the kind of guy that he's so effective when he's got a chip on his shoulder. He's not the biggest kid, but he plays like he's a foot taller. He's got great wheels. He's got a good head and his shoulders. And he's so good at sort of using the tools that he has and his enthusiasm and his pace to really elevate his game and the game of those around him. I don't think we've seen close to his best this year. We've seen, for all due respect to the player, we've seen a B plus Jacob Pelche, which, I mean, still means I think there's a lot of levels left to his game, and I think we're going to see a lot more from him next season, with a full season of recovery and training camp and all that, especially considering that he needs waivers next year. So I think barring anything weird, he's probably going to be playing in the NHL next year. But much like with thinking that this might be the swan song for Dustin Wolf at the American League level, this very well might be the swan song for Jacob Pelche at the American League level. And I think much like, coming out of last year's playoff series, coming out of this season to date, I think Pelche has a chip on his shoulder, and I think he feels like he has something to prove. And he's a guy that plays so well in so many different situations that I don't know if he's going to be a guy who really goes out of his way to do anything too fancy, but if he's doing all the little things he does well effectively, he can be a really big factor on the series.
And Paige, I think something that people sometimes lose in the wind a little bit is when Pelche came into the American League 2 seasons ago, 2021-22. This is a guy who kind of took the league by storm. He was a 21-year-old kid who was scoring at about a point per game pace in his first season. Now, granted, he's playing on a very good line. He was playing with Matthew Phillips on that top line, and they worked very well together. But this was a player who went on the next season to have another great year and really produced at every level before that injury. And he came back, and as Pike said, he probably was B plus version of himself in terms of his health. But this is a guy whose offensive abilities can't really be understated.
Yeah, and I think he's probably at a bit of a frustrating point in his season right now. Obviously, he would have liked to come back 100%, go back to the Flames and maybe ride it out for the rest of the season, and that didn't really happen. And even when he's come back to the Wranglers, you could tell that it's not the same confidence. He is trying, the effort is there, he is getting top line minutes, but also the Matthew Phillips thing is a huge factor as well, because that was his buddy, that was his guy for the last 2 seasons, and he's not there. And I've got to say, watching those two play was like the most satisfying hockey I've ever seen. They would know past each other all the time, and it would blow my mind. And he doesn't have that he doesn't have that level of chemistry with anybody yet. We'll say that because he hasn't had the time with them. So you're kind of wondering, who does he fit in well with? The last series, he looked pretty good with Cole Schwindt and Matt Coronado. When he came back, he had a bit of time with Ben Jones and Sam Morton, and there was some stuff working around there too. But it's also trying to find the perfect player to complement his play, because he's not always going to be the clutch player, but when he is, he's huge. Because last year he had that the overtime winner for the Wranglers as well too, and that was a huge moment for him. And I mean, I still go through the gallery and see the photos of him celebrating that win and everything, and that's where he wants to be. And right now, he's probably not feeling like he's where he wants to be and how much he wants to be helping the team, but he'll still come out and do everything he can if that doesn't mean putting up 1,000,000 points in a series or anything.
Just the nicest guy too. I mean, just you're around this team so often, as you and I often are, and it's just you interacting with Jacob Pelche. It's like he's so friendly, and it's just awesome. I think everybody wants to see him back to his best, which, as we've seen, can be a very, very good player. And the Wranglers don't necessarily have the same level of forward depth this season as they did in previous years. One place where that's not really true, though, is on defense. And we kind of need to talk about this because, we touched upon earlier how guys like Lipinski and Etienne Morin and so on have been released from their tryouts. One guy who hasn't is Hunter Brustevich. Now, he wasn't in Tucson during that playoff series. He stayed back home to practice with the team. I don't know if he'll be even a consideration to play in this round against Coachella Valley. Probably not, because they're going to go with the guys who got them there. Earlier today, I asked about Artem Grushnikov. I just checked in, and I was told there's no update. And I don't know if that means that there's nothing to report, or if he just nothing has changed in terms of maybe he's not fit to play, or I don't know what the scenario is with Artem, because he didn't play against Tucson in round one. But the fact is that the Wranglers, Pike, have a lot of defensemen. You go down this list, they got Grushnikov, Brustevich, Jeremy Poirier, Colton Poolman, Ilya Solovyov, Mark Pesek, Jordan Osterley, Brady Lyle, Yan Kuznetsov, and Jonathan Aspero. And people might not realize, but the leading scorer among that group this year was Jonathan Aspero, which is, kind of, I mean, granted, Poirier would missed most of the season, but maybe not the name that you would first glom onto. He also played some stretches at forward this season, which is worth noting. But either way, Pike, how do you expect the Wranglers to handle this glut of defensemen?
I kind of like the way they did it. I mean, I think a lot of it hinges on, I don't think Jeremy Poirier is exactly where Jeremy Poirier wants to be right now. And so what they've ended up doing is the second pairing is essentially three guys. The second pairing is Colton Poolman. In offensive situations, he's with Jeremy Poirier. In defensive situations, he's with Yan Kuznetsov. And Kuznetsov is, to be blunt, kind of a non-entity offensively, which he's a shutdown guy, and he's quite good at it. And so he's used on the PK with Poolman and in D-zone situations. And Poirier, you probably want him to be feeling like he's got some swagger before you put him into some defensive situations, especially in the playoffs. And so they have the ability to insulate two guys in Poirier and Kuznetsov that complement each other in ways, but also sort of are complete opposites in ways. And they end up using Poolman as sort of the glue guy, like he's been all year. And to be blunt, that's probably why he wears a letter. He's so consistent and effective that you don't really need to worry about him. And, as a result, you get a chance to really lean on that top pairing they've used of Jordan Osterley and Ilya Solovyov. Solovyov was basically a second goalie on the ice for some of the penalty kills the last couple of games against Tucson. He's been really effective, and I think he's another one of those guys that, we saw him early in the season. I saw him at the Heritage Classic in Edmonton. He was okay. He went down. He got better. And the last couple weeks of the season he was up. He was really good in the NHL for what they wanted him to do as a PK and defensive oriented guy. Very good for that role. And so I think he's a guy who came back to the AHL with a lot of confidence. And as a result, they probably feel like they have two pairings that they can really lean on, and it allows them to sort of shelter that de facto third pairing of Jonathan Aspero and Mark Pisek a bit. Aspero is a power play specialist. He is a guy you kind of have to shelter a bit at 5-on-5. But he's got some tread on the tires. He got signed to an AHL deal out of Flames camp, and I think the reason for it is he, especially once the Wranglers lost Poirier to injury, Aspero was kind of the one guy that could really pop their power play a bit when they needed him to, and I think they have a lot of guys they like. Obviously, Grushnikov, I suspect we'll see him at some point if he's available. But again, he's a guy that, he's more of a shutdown guy. And if you look at sort of the different roles that they used in the first series, I'm kind of questioning, like, if you have Lyle and Grushnikov available, who do you necessarily swap out to use them? And for me, that's where I arrived to. With the 7 guys they've used, I think they've used them as well as they possibly could. And I think that the way that they were utilized contributed to 2 wins in some pretty close hockey games.
Well, it's kind of worth mentioning too. They're only dressing one righty on defense right now with Pesek, and which is kind of strange. I mean, obviously you have Colton Poolman, who's played the right side for most of his tenure in Calgary. He has played primarily with Jeremy Poirier, and as you mentioned, they're kind of splitting that up a little bit. They're playing 2 lefties on their top pair, and even a guy like Grushnikov, he's a lefty too. So you're really the only other 2 righties on the roster are Lyle and Bruce Devitt, and again, I'd be surprised if Bruce Devitt draws into a game. Lyle is possible, but like you said, Pike, it's tough to envision a scenario where they deviate that strongly from this group of guys. But it's kind of interesting. Paige, I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts just in terms of Jeremy Poirier, Jan Kuznetsov. I remember talking last year to Mitch Love, and again this year a little bit with Trent Call. They always talk about their young defensemen, and they sort of lump them together in terms of it's sort of a trifecta of Solovyov, Kuznetsov, and Poirier. And just this year, they have all kind of had different experiences. Solovyov's been up and down. Kuznetsov's been in and out a little bit, and Poirier, of course, missed a long time. But in terms of their statures inside this organization, because as we all know, they made a lot of moves at the deadline to get guys like Daniil Miramanov and Nikita Hotiuk, and a little bit earlier, Braden Pahal and then Joel Hanley. They've got a lot of defensemen, but what does the future hold for those 3 guys?
I mean, to start with Poirier, I think the way he started the season, we would have expected him to see him up with the Flames at some point. Obviously, injury got in the way of that. And I mean, once hopefully off season isn't too soon, but when we do get there, he knows where he needs to be to kind of get to that next level. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if we see Poirier in the NHL the next season or 2. I'm hoping, fingers crossed, he stays healthy, but that's also like he's kind of on that same path that Pelche is a bit. Like, people know what he is, what he's able to do. He is an offensive defenseman. He's still working on getting back into kind of the offensive rhythm again. So it'll be really interesting to see that hopefully emerge back into his game sooner rather than later. So the future is bright for Poirier, that's for sure. Kuznetsov is kind of, Pike, you put it a really, really good way, a really respectful way of kind of what we can expect out of Kuznetsov. But he's going to be the guy, you know what you're getting out of him. He's going to be consistent. He can come in. He's a team guy. He's a team player. I don't think we've had an opportunity to kind of have one-on-ones with him too much, but he's bought into the system. He's been around. He knows kind of the way the Wranglers, the way they go. He's kind of a part of kind of a quiet leadership, I would say. Like, he kind of helps cultivate that culture around the Wranglers. So I don't know if necessarily we'll see like Kuznetsov making any exciting moves out of camp or anything. But you never know. That would be a player that I would really actually like for us, for him to surprise us. So
we said similar things about Solovyov like 2 years ago, though, because like until Nick DeSimone and Solovyov really gelled, we saw that extra elements of Solovyov's game. Like, I think folks were projecting Solovyov as sort of like a meat and potatoes, stay at home, oh shucks, we maybe never see him, do much at the pro level kind of guy. And you got to give him credit for doing the work. But I think if you're the Wranglers, the nice thing of seeing Solovyov progress and have success is that if you're that dev team and that coaching staff, you look at him and what worked for him and what unlocked him. And I think you look at Kuznetsov and Grushnikov and go, okay, I think we kind of know what could work and what we could try. And I think, granted, you need to find the right players to unlock guys. I think, Solovyov owes a lot of his blossoming to Nick DeSimone and the chemistry they developed. But I think I'm not willing to write off Kuznetsov, but he's also one of those guys that you're like, okay, there's a lot of defensemen of a similar archetype in the system, both at the NHL and the AHL levels. And, I hope he doesn't become the odd man out because, it was a guy that had a lot of buzz his draft year as sort of a really reliable, smart, toolsy defensive guy. And, it's the worst thing for him, unfortunately, is that the Flames have oodles of those types of guys right now.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point to make. And, I'm very curious to see how things pan out. And there's going to be players coming in. And that's kind of how I want to finish things off because, again, we've talked a lot about this iteration of the team, how they're going to fare against Coachella Valley, which is a team, again, that kind of had their number this year. They won, I think, as Pike mentioned before the show, before we went live. Wranglers won the first and last game of the season against Coachella Valley and sprinkled in a lot of losses in between. So it'll be curious to see how things play out this time around. Last year, it was a series where the Wranglers lost in the maximum 5 games after splitting the first 2 at home. They won game 4 in Coachella, but lost games 3 and 5.
It was almost a 6-game series crammed into 5 games, though. They played 4 overtime periods.
Gosh, yeah.
It was the longest series ever. It reminded me a lot of the Stockton Heat Chicago Wolves playoff series from the year before. But yeah, it was a series that you kind of thought whoever won it would have a very good chance at going all the way, and it ended up being Coachella Valley going to the final, losing to the Hershey Bears. This time around, kind of has a different feel. The Wranglers didn't squeak into the playoffs. They had a healthy lead over the 8th spot in the Pacific Division, but they weren't the dominant force that we saw. Now, in terms of the future, the Flames, again, haven't made a ton of draft picks recently, but they do have some guys who are 2004s. They've got one guy in the WHL who is with them right now, who will probably be with them next year, who's an 03. Pike, they've made these picks. Who do you expect to see in terms of the most impactful players in next year's Wranglers rookie crop?
I mean, I think the list begins with Sam Honzik, another guy that unfortunately had just horrible injury luck. He suffered an abdominal injury in his last preseason game. The plan was him to play that preseason game in Edmonton, then hop on a plane and join the Vancouver Giants, potentially to become a center that year. That did not happen because of an awkward collision, and it basically cost him his season until mid-December. And then I think he got smacked in the face. I don't know the extent of his injuries, but he wore a bubble for a good chunk of the year after he got back from the World Juniors. So he did not have a great year injury-wise or production-wise. I think one has to do with the other. But Honzik's a guy that they really have high hopes for because of all the tools he has. Hunter Brzustevich is also on an entry-level deal. I think he's a guy that's going to step in. I think they have really high hopes for him. Both of those players are 04s. They're both eligible to go back to junior next year. I don't think either of them will start in junior. At the very least, they'll be given every chance to be with the Wranglers. And from them, we'll see. But I mean, this is going to be an interesting year because, we'll see potentially Valtteri Ignaciu with the Wranglers full time. I don't know what that means for Oscar Dansk. Probably nothing, to be blunt, probably not great, nothing great for his chances, unfortunately, even though he's been really effective for them. On the blue line, Yoni Yurmo will be given a chance, and he's on an entry level. I have no idea how they're going to deal with all the defensemen they have at the NHL, AHL level. They have too many defensemen. They could play 8 defensemen a game and not have enough spot for defensemen. But even Sam Morton, getting a chance to be a full-timer next year after coming in. I mean, we talk about all the tryout guys. I mean, Sam Morton's a guy who came in on an ATO. His NHL deal doesn't start till next year. He's the only ATO guy still playing a regular role because he came in and he was so effective so quickly they couldn't take him out of the lineup. And so there's everyday AHL players who played with this team since October who are sitting because Sam Morton's good enough to take their gig. And I think that means that he's set a bar for himself. And I'm really fascinated what Morton could look like with a full summer, with a full training camp, because a lot of guys, we talked about Coronado, we talked about Stromgren. Stromgren had the opportunity to play a little bit of AHL last year before going home to Sweden for the summer. Coronado played a game of the NHL, and then he went back home to finish school. If you're Morton, he has an extended audition to figure out the AHL game, then go home and get ready to be a full-timer. And to be honest, he could potentially be the most impactful of these first-year pros next year because of the head start he's been able to give himself by playing so well so quickly.
Yeah, I think that's all very fair. And of course, there's also Parker Bell, who's going to be coming in probably next season. Is maybe we'll see how much he plays, but they've got some guys. They obviously had Jaden Lipinski on an ATO. He'll probably go back to the Vancouver Giants because he doesn't have an entry level contract yet. And there's a couple other guys who ATM Moran is an 05, so he'll definitely be going back to the QMJHL. Adar Suniev is still in college. Yegor Yegorov, who knows? But anyway, they've got, as you mentioned, Pike, a lot of guys coming in. Paige, the last question that I just want to ask you here is the Wranglers this year are a different team than we have seen. And the last couple of years, they have blended young players and veterans, I think, very, very effectively. And especially, I go back a couple of years when they were still the Stockton Heat, and they went on a very good run. And you can say they were veterans, but they were prospects when the Flames acquired them, but they did have a slightly larger contingent, I would say, of strictly veteran players in the American League and it's not to say that they don't have them anymore with the likes of Brett Sutter and Clark Bishop and guys like that and Mark Pesek. But what do you think the future of this team should be in terms of not just having the young players, but also bringing in maybe some more veteran players? I'm not going to mention Matthew Phillips specifically, but that's one player who they could potentially bring in. But I'm just talking about maybe the guys like the Alan Quines, the Byron Phrases, or the Nick DeSimones. Do you think there's maybe a bit more room for some more veteran players to guide these youngsters along?
I think so, absolutely. It's really hard starting a professional career not having like a dad, almost like a dad type role on your team to kind of help you out, especially if you're away from home, playing in a different country, whatever it be. I think the Flames organization as a whole does a really good job of kind of having that internal mentorship between their players. So I think that's something that's almost like embedded into kind of the culture of the organization is you need to have the guy that's going to kind of take you under your wing and make sure that you're, doing the right things, showing up to practice on time, kind of continuing the type of community work or anything like that. That's kind of stuff that we see kind of behind the scenes and in front of the media and everything like that. I think as long as the Wranglers are under the Flames, they're always going to have an aspect of that. And I don't know what the future looks like for someone like Brett Sutter. It
Yeah.
might be because this could be the last we see of him with this team. I hope not. But as they get up there in age, they kind of have their futures in their own hands if they want to decide to continue or not. So I think the way that we've seen the leadership role go within this team and within this organization is they're going to be the mentor. They're going to be the one that's setting the expectation for the younger players, and the younger players are either going to pick it up and be successful or they're not. And I don't think we don't have the very many examples of players that haven't fallen in line with the team culture and have failed because of it. I think with this development team that they've been able to kind of find the best traits of their game and figure out what kind of players they want to be. And even someone like Jacob Pelche towards the end of the year, he's wearing a letter. That was something that we haven't seen at this level before. And Jacob Pelche coming in as a high energy jokester type of guy all of a sudden is in a leadership position. Not that he doesn't deserve it. Absolutely he deserves it. But that is definitely off the backs of the leadership he's had the last 2 years at the AHL level.
Yeah, it's kind of curious because we talk a little bit about the Flames and how active they're going to be in free agency, and the answer is probably not that active. Maybe a couple of small signings, but you sometimes wonder maybe they'll be more active in terms of adding guys for the Wranglers, and I think there's room to do it because, it's kind of the point that I was making going back a couple of years ago when you look at the Stockton Heat roster that was in their final year in California. And some of those guys that they had who were a little bit older started out as prospects. And you're seeing that again, like you said, with guys like Jacob Pelche a little bit. But that was still a team that had the guys like Byron Phrase and Nick DeSimone and Justin Kirkland and Luke Philp. And it was a team that was, it still had the young guys like Connor Zary and Marty Pospisil, Adam Rosichka back then, but it also had the Andy Walensky's and the Kevin Gravels. And it's kind of interesting to see just the balance that is always there in the American Hockey League when you're always seeing guys coming in on 1-year deals or 2-year deals, just plying that trade. It's going to be really interesting. And I think Brad Pascal has a lot of interesting opportunities available to him this summer. And I'm looking forward to it because the Wranglers, when they're good, are a really exciting thing to have in our city. And I think people are still discovering that a little bit. And, it's just a lot of fun. And we're lucky in that we are one of only 2 NHL markets to have the farm team playing in the exact same building as the home team, the NHL team. The other one's Winnipeg, and we're the other one. And it's a really exciting time. And I think fans would be remiss not to come down for games 1 and 2 on Friday, which, if you're watching this, is today, and Sunday, Sunday, May the 5th. That's when game 2 is. And then the final 3 games, assuming they're necessary, will be on the road. Before we go, just want to poll both of you guys. I'll start with you, Pike. Again, they're the lower seed, but if you had to go out on a limb, who do you think is going to come out big in this series? Who's going to come out on top? And then who is going to come up big? Who's the X factor that you want to see for this Wranglers team?
I'm going to be mean and say Coachella Valley, but I'm going to say in 5. I think the Wranglers are going to, if they go down, they're going to go down swinging. And I think this is going to be a pretty emotional, physical series. These are two teams that know each other very well and don't particularly like each other. I'm really fascinated to see what Adam Klapka can do in sort of a more of a trench war series, because, he's been their golden retriever. Can he get a little bit more bite to his game? We saw a bit of it in Calgary. He got in that fight in the second last game. Actually, the last game of this season. He got a goal in a fight, and he couldn't quite get the Gordie Howe, but he's got that kind of the snarl to his game at times. And I think it might take a series like this to really tease it out of him. And I think if he can tease it out more often than not, he could be really effective for the Wranglers in this series.
All right, Paige, you're up.
I don't think I can go against the Wranglers on that. I'm too close to them, so I have a little bit of my bias there. I think it's still going to go the full series as well, but I really, really, really am crossing my fingers and hoping for an upset there, that the Wranglers come out in 5. I also have high hopes on Klapka. I also am interested to see if this Stromgren little thing he has going on continues. Someone else we haven't really talked about is Cole Schwint as well. I'm really interested to see how he does down the stretch. He's moved his way up the lineup as well. He's getting more playing time, getting more opportunities. He's someone that Coachella Valley might not have on the top of their on their report on who they need to be looking at or anything, but that's someone that can come out and surprise them. Obviously, someone like Matt Coronado is going to be huge for the team, and Coachella Valley is going to know that he can score, so they're going to try and shut him down. But those kind of middle tier players are the ones that I think can be really effective in this series.
Yeah, the depth's going to be the difference. I agree with you. And Schwint's, good on you for mentioning Schwint, because that's a player who has made improvements. I really like his hand-eye. I love him in front of the net on the power play. I'd be very curious to see him, even trying out that in with the Flames. I think there would be an interesting opportunity there for him, and Lord knows they have the need for guys who can stand in front of the net, make those moves, score from in tight. I agree with both of you. I think it's going to be a long series. I don't think it's going to be a sweep for either side. I don't know. I really go back and forth if it's going to be Coachella Valley or Calgary. Again, Coachella Valley had the regular season, but these Wranglers, they got the reinforcements. There's just something about them. They got a really good thing going. And I'm with you, Paige. This little Stromgren thing, as you said, it's going to be really interesting to see if it can continue. The guy who I'm really curious in seeing how he shows up, I don't know. There's so many. I can't pick just one. I'm curious to see what Riley Damiani can do. He scored a goal in 2 games against Tucson, but this is a guy who, when he was first coming in with Texas a couple seasons ago in the American League, he was like near a point a game with their American League team. He was a guy who I think was named to the AHL All-Rookie team in the first year that I started covering the American League. And this is a guy who, I was thinking, along with Dallas's younger guys like Stankoven and Johnston and Ty Dellandrea, this is a guy who maybe has some jump. And it just didn't click. It took a little while, and it sort of went down. And since he came to Calgary, he's had a bit of a rough go. He only had 1 point in the regular season after the trade. But I would love to see something there. I'd love to see Ben Jones have a great series. Ben Jones is a guy who I think is definitely earned Ryan Pike's respect since he came to Calgary. He's been a fun player to watch.
He's missed 1 game in 2 years. He's their most. He's like a metronome.
Yeah, he's been good, and you know what? He has done a good job as sort of a facsimile top line center down there, playing with some really good wingers and holding his end of the bargain in terms of
He can play with anybody. He's a
yeah,
chameleon.
he's a really good player. So again, I go up and down the list. I would love to see Artem Grushnikov draw in for a game this series, presuming that he's healthy enough to do so. I would love to see Jeremy Poirier have a big series. He didn't have a point against Tucson. Again, he's still very much coming back from that long absence, but again, they've got a deep team. They maybe don't have the stars right at the forefront, the Phillipses, the Zaries, but they do have the Dustin Wolf, and it's hard to bet against a team with Dustin Wolf. So I will stop. I will stop equivocating. I will say that the Wranglers take this one, and I'm going to say that they take it in 4.
Oh.
Yeah, fine. Just sue me. Sue me. Why not? I just want to say something a little bit different. So, in any event, I think this has been a really fun show. I'm glad that you guys joined me. I hope all of you watching have taken something out of this in some way or some form. Pike, Paige, so much fun. Hope to see you both at Game 1. And I think I can speak for you both when I say, go Wranglers.
Go Wranglers.
Absolutely. Thanks for watching, everybody. This has been the Calgary Wranglers 2024 playoff preview show brought to you by Betway.